There are moments in history that slip through the cracks of textbooks, moments so profound they reshape our understanding of what it means to be human. This is one of those moments. It's about a woman whose name you might not know, whose face appears in only a handful of faded photographs, but whose actions echo through the generations like ripples spreading across still water. Her name was Margaret, just Margaret to most people who knew her, though the military records listed her full name as Margaret Elizabeth Harrington, registered nurse, serial number 47892, but numbers and official designations could never capture who she really was. She was 29 years old when the war broke out, working in a civilian hospital in a small coastal town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the biggest excitement was usually the arrival of the fishing boats at dawn. She had gentle hands, people said, the kind of hands that could soothe a crying child or steady a trembling elderly patient. Her eyes were hazel, flecked with gold when the light hit them just right, and they held a warmth that made patients feel seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time in their lives. She wasn't particularly tall, wasn't particularly striking in any conventional sense, but there was something about her presence that made people feel safer, as if her very existence was a promise that everything might somehow be okay. When the recruitment officers came through town with their crisp uniforms and stirring speeches about duty and honor, Margaret didn't hesitate. She signed up the very next day, much to her mother's horror and her father's quiet pride. Her younger sister cried and begged her not to go, clinging to her sleeve like she had when they were children and Margaret would leave for school. But Margaret had made up her mind. If men were going to die in some distant land, someone needed to be there to hold their hands, to whisper comfort in their final moments, to fight for their lives with the same ferocity that soldiers fought battles. 3 months later, she found herself on a troopship, crossing an ocean that seemed to stretch into infinity. The vessel rolled and pitched, and most of the other nurses spent their days being sick into buckets. But Margaret stood on deck whenever she could, watching the horizon and thinking about what lay ahead. She wasn't naive. She knew what war meant. She'd read the reports, seen the casualty lists published in newspapers, heard the whispered stories from veterans of previous conflicts. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally are two entirely different things. Nothing could have prepared her for the field hospital. It was set up in a converted monastery. Centuries-old stone walls that had once echoed with prayers, now reverberating with screams and moans, and the steady drip of blood into metal pans. The smell hit her first, the day she arrived. It was a combination of antiseptic, gangrene, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something indefinable that she would later understand was simply the smell of death waiting in the wings. The head nurse, a stern woman named Catherine with iron-grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin, gave Margaret a 10-minute orientation that consisted mostly of pointing at supply closets and warning her not to get emotionally attached to patients. They come in, you patch them up or you don't, and they move on, Catherine said flatly. The moment you start caring is the moment you break, and we can't afford broken nurses here. Margaret nodded, but she knew even then that she couldn't follow that advice. It wasn't in her nature to see suffering and remain detached. It wasn't in her nature to touch a human being and not feel the full weight of their humanity pressing back against her fingertips. The first soldier she treated was a boy named Thomas, though everyone called him Tommy. He was 19 years old, with freckles scattered across his nose and a smile that persisted even though half his leg was gone. He'd been hit by shrapnel 3 days earlier, and by the time he reached their hospital, infection had set in. Margaret could smell it before she even pulled back the bandages, that sickly sweet odor of tissue dying. She worked on him for 6 hours straight, cleaning the wound, debriding dead tissue, applying fresh dressings. Tommy drifted in and out of consciousness, and when he was awake, he talked about his mother. He had 12 brothers and sisters, he told her. 12. Could she imagine? His mother was a saint, he said, an absolute saint. She made the best apple pie in 3 counties. He was going to take Margaret to taste it when he got home. He promised she absolutely had to try his mother's apple pie. Margaret smiled and nodded, and promised she would love to try it, even as she calculated the odds of him surviving the night. They weren't good. The infection was too advanced, had spread too far. Even if they amputated higher up, which would be the logical next step, his body was already weakening from the toxins in his bloodstream. But Tommy didn't die that night, or the next. Against all medical logic, against every probability, he held on. Margaret checked on him every chance she got, between the endless parade of other wounded men who needed her attention. She changed his dressings 3 times a day, instead of the recommended twice. She made sure he got extra rations when they were available. She sat by his bed late at night, when she should have been sleeping, talking to him about his mother's apple pie, about his plans for the future, about the farm he wanted to buy when he went home. 3 weeks later, Tommy was transferred to a hospital ship bound for home. He would live. He would walk with a pronounced limp for the rest of his life, would wake up some nights with phantom pains in the leg that no longer existed. But he would live to taste his mother's apple pie again, to help raise his younger siblings, to eventually have children of his own who would climb on his lap and ask about the scar. Margaret watched him go with a mixture of profound satisfaction and bone-deep exhaustion. 1 life saved, 999 to go, though she didn't know that number then. She had no way of knowing what the coming months would demand of her, no way to understand how she would be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. The casualties came in waves. Sometimes they had quiet periods where the hospital held only a dozen patients, men recovering from relatively minor wounds or illness. During those lulls, Margaret and the other nurses would write letters home, would mend their uniforms, would sit in the monastery's ancient courtyard and try to remember what peace felt like. But then the waves would hit. Artillery barrages, major offensives, disasters in the trenches. Suddenly the hospital would be overflowing with broken bodies, with men screaming for their mothers, with stumps where limbs used to be and holes where faces once were. Margaret learned to perform triage in 30 seconds. A glance was all she needed to assess who might be saved and who was beyond help. It was brutal, that calculation, reducing human beings to mathematical equations of survival probability. But it was necessary. In the chaos of mass casualties, every minute counted. Every decision could mean the difference between life and death, not just for 1 soldier but for 10, for 20. She learned to amputate limbs with steady hands, learned to probe for bullets and shrapnel in men's bodies, learned to pack chest wounds and pray. She learned to lie convincingly, to tell men they were going to be fine even when she knew they had hours at most. She learned to distinguish between the screams that meant pain and the screams that meant surrender, that final giving up that preceded death. But she also learned something else, something that Catherine, the head nurse, had tried to warn her against. She learned that every single patient had a story, had a life that extended beyond this horrible place, had people who loved them and waited for them and prayed for their safe return. And she couldn't unlearn that. She couldn't make herself not care. There was Samuel, a quiet man of 35 who had left behind a wife and 3 daughters to come fight. He'd taken a bullet to the abdomen, and while they'd managed to remove it, internal damage was extensive. He was dying slowly, over the course of days, and he knew it. He didn't rage against it or weep. He simply asked Margaret, very calmly, if she would write a letter to his wife. He dictated it to her in short bursts between waves of pain, telling his wife how much he loved her, telling his daughters to be good and help their mother, telling them all that he was sorry he wouldn't be there to see the girls grow up, but that he would be watching over them always. Margaret wrote every word, her handwriting steady even as tears rolled down her cheeks and splashed onto the paper, blurring the ink in places. She mailed the letter herself, walking 3 miles to the nearest postal station because she wanted to make absolutely sure it would reach Samuel's family. And when he died 2 days later, she held his hand and whispered to him about his daughters, describing futures for them that she invented on the spot, beautiful lives full of love and happiness, until his breathing slowed and stopped. There was James, barely 18, who had lied about his age to enlist. He'd been blinded by a shell that exploded too close, and he was terrified, absolutely terrified, of going home blind, of being a burden to his family. Margaret spent hours with him, teaching him to navigate by touch and sound, convincing him that his life wasn't over, that he could still have purpose and joy and love. She read to him from books she scrounged from abandoned buildings, her voice growing hoarse but never stopping. When he finally left for home, he hugged her and said she had saved his life, though not a drop of his blood had been spilled in her care. There was Peter, a career soldier who had served for 15 years and had survived more battles than he could count. He finally took a bullet to the lung that should have killed him within minutes, but Margaret wouldn't let him die. She worked on him with a fury that surprised even herself, manually pumping air into his damaged lung, massaging his heart when it tried to give up, screaming at him to hold on, to fight, to live. And somehow, impossibly, he did. He survived to retire from the army and open a bookshop in a quiet village, where he would tell customers about the nurse who had literally refused to let death take him. The months blurred together. Fall turned to winter, and the monastery's stone walls became unbearably cold. They ran out of coal for heating, and had to burn whatever wood they could scavenge. Margaret learned to work with numb fingers, learned to ignore the way her breath frosted in the air as she changed bandages and administered medicine. Frostbite became as common an ailment as shrapnel wounds. She treated men whose feet had turned black from the cold, who had lost toes and fingers to the relentless winter. Winter gave way to spring, but the war didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. New offensives were launched. New weapons were deployed. Gas attacks sent men to the hospital coughing up pieces of their own lungs. Their eyes burned, their skin blistered. Margaret learned to treat chemical burns, though half the time there was little she could do except ease the pain and hope the body's own defenses would somehow prevail. She began to change, though she didn't realize it at first. The Margaret who had arrived at the field hospital, full of idealism and determination, was being worn down by the relentless tide of suffering. She stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. She stopped eating regularly, existing on coffee and whatever scraps she could grab between patients. She stopped writing letters home because she couldn't find words to describe what she was experiencing, couldn't bridge the chasm between this world and the world her family inhabited. Her hands, those gentle hands everyone had remarked upon, became scarred and rough. Her eyes, which had sparkled with warmth, developed a 1,000-yard stare that she caught sometimes when she glimpsed herself in a mirror. She was 29 when she arrived. She felt 90, but she kept going. Every morning she woke up and put on her uniform and walked into the hospital and did the work, because the alternative, stopping, giving up, was unthinkable. Every life she saved was a small victory against the vast machine of destruction that surrounded them. Every man she sent home was a testament to the idea that humanity could prevail even in the darkest circumstances. There was one night, though, when she nearly broke. They had received over 200 casualties in a 6-hour period following a catastrophic assault. The hospital was overwhelmed. They'd run out of beds and had men lying on the floor. They'd run out of morphine and had to operate on some men with nothing but whiskey for pain relief. They'd run out of bandages and were tearing up sheets, tablecloths, anything fabric they could find. Margaret had been working for 16 hours straight when she was sent to triage a new arrival. He was a young man, maybe 22, and he'd taken shrapnel to the chest and abdomen. As she examined him, as she pressed her hand against the gaping wound in his torso, trying to staunch the bleeding, he looked up at her with eyes that were achingly familiar. For a moment, she thought he was her brother, John, her younger brother, who had also enlisted, and who she hadn't heard from in months. The resemblance was uncanny. Same dark hair, same shape to the face, same way of looking at her with a mixture of fear and trust. "Am I going to die?" he asked her, his voice barely a whisper. Margaret opened her mouth to reassure him, to tell him he would be fine, but the words wouldn't come. She could feel his blood pumping out between her fingers. She could see the grey tinge to his skin, the way his pupils were dilating. He was dying, and there was nothing she could do. They needed a surgeon, needed proper equipment, needed things they simply didn't have in this moment. "I don't want to die," he whispered. "Please, I don't want to die." And something in Margaret shattered. All the months of holding it together, of being strong, of being the steady presence that others relied upon, suddenly crumbled. She felt tears streaming down her face, felt her body shaking, felt the weight of every patient she'd lost crushing down on her. "I know," she managed to say. "I know. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." She held him as he died. This boy who reminded her of her brother. This boy who had a mother and father, and perhaps siblings of his own, waiting for him somewhere. She held him and she cried, really cried, for the first time since arriving at the hospital. She cried for him and for Tommy and for Samuel and for all the others, for the staggering weight of human suffering she witnessed every single day. Catherine found her there 20 minutes later, still holding the dead boy, still crying. The head nurse, that stern woman who had warned Margaret not to get emotionally attached, sat down beside her in the blood-soaked dirt. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she put her arm around Margaret's shoulders and pulled her close. "I lied to you," Catherine said quietly. "When you first arrived, I told you not to care. But that was a lie. You have to care. It's the only way to do this work and remain human. The trick isn't not caring. The trick is caring so much that you fight like hell for every single one of them, and then forgiving yourself when you can't save them all." They sat there together, two nurses in blood-stained uniforms, surrounded by suffering and death, and Margaret felt something shift inside her. She hadn't broken after all. She'd cracked, yes, but cracks could be mended, and sometimes things that had been broken and mended were stronger than they'd been before. She stood up, wiped her eyes, and went back to work. The war continued. More casualties came, more lives hung in the balance. But Margaret approached her work differently now. She still cared deeply about every patient, still fought fiercely for their survival, but she also accepted that she was human, that her power had limits, that sometimes, despite her best efforts, death would win. She developed rituals to help her cope. After losing a patient, she would step outside for exactly 5 minutes, no matter the weather, and look at the sky. Rain or shine, day or night, she would stand there and breathe and remind herself that there was a world beyond this hospital, beyond this war. Then she would go back inside and treat the next patient. She started keeping a journal, not a detailed diary, but simple entries. Saved to today. Lost one. Tomorrow I will do better. Sometimes that was all she wrote. Sometimes she added a name, a detail, a memory she wanted to preserve, but writing it down helped. It made the experiences feel less overwhelming, more manageable, and she started building a community with the other nurses and doctors. They shared their breaks together, their meals when they had them. They traded stories about patients who had recovered, about small victories and moments of grace. They sang songs together sometimes, their voices drifting through the monastery's ancient halls, a reminder that joy could exist even in this place of pain. There was a young doctor named Robert who had arrived a few months after Margaret. He was brilliant but awkward, better with medical textbooks than with people. Margaret noticed that his patients were often tense, nervous, unable to relax even when he was trying to help them. So she started assisting him, standing at his side during procedures, talking to the patients in a calm, soothing voice while he worked. Together, they made a good team. His technical skill and her human touch complemented each other perfectly. They saved dozens of lives together, working through long nights and chaotic days, and somewhere along the way, amid the blood and suffering, they became friends. They talked about their lives before the war, about their hopes for after. Robert told her about his dream of opening a clinic in a rural area where people had limited access to healthcare. Margaret told him about wanting to teach nursing, to pass on what she'd learned to the next generation. "You'd be an excellent teacher," Robert said one evening as they sat in the courtyard, sharing a precious bar of chocolate someone had sent from home. "You have patience, and you understand that medicine isn't just about the body, it's about the person inside that body." Margaret smiled. "You could learn that too. You know, you're getting better at it. I've noticed." He ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. "I have a good teacher." Spring turned to summer, the second summer of Margaret's deployment. She'd been at the field hospital for over a year now, though it felt simultaneously like a lifetime and like no time at all. Time moved strangely in war. Days could drag on forever while months vanished in what felt like moments. They received word that a major offensive was planned. The hospital staff prepared for the inevitable influx of casualties. They stockpiled supplies, set up additional beds, steeled themselves for what was coming. Margaret found herself thinking about Catherine's words. Care so much that you fight like hell for every single one, and forgive yourself when you can't save them all. The offensive began on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, the casualties started arriving. By Tuesday evening, the hospital was overwhelmed. By Wednesday, they were in full crisis mode, triaging patients in the courtyard because there was no more room inside. Margaret worked without stopping for 36 hours. Her fingers moved by muscle memory, tying sutures, applying bandages, administering injections. She stopped thinking, stopped feeling, became almost mechanical in her efficiency. It was the only way to cope with the sheer volume of suffering. Somewhere in the midst of the chaos, a man was carried in on a stretcher. He was unconscious, his uniform torn and bloody, one arm clearly shattered. Margaret did her quick assessment. Survivable injuries, but he needed surgery soon. She tagged him for the operating room and moved on to the next patient. Hours later, when the initial wave had been processed and the most critical patients were stabilized, she found herself in the post-operative ward, checking on recent surgeries. She stopped at a bed where a man was sleeping restlessly, his right arm immobilized in a cast and splint. There was something familiar about him. She checked his chart. Lieutenant David Morrison, age 32, compound fracture of the radius and ulna, multiple lacerations, minor concussion. She looked at his face more closely and felt her heart skip. She knew him. Not well, but she knew him. He'd been a teacher in a town near where she'd grown up. She'd met him at a regional education conference years ago, before the war. They'd talked for maybe 20 minutes about the challenges of rural education. And now here he was, broken and unconscious in her hospital. She checked his vitals, made some adjustments to his four, and made a note to check on him specifically during her next rounds. There was something about seeing someone from before, someone who existed in her memory as a person rather than as a casualty, that reminded her why she was doing this work. David woke up the next day, confused and in pain. Margaret was the one who told him where he was, what had happened, what his prognosis was. His arm would heal, she assured him, though it would take time, and he probably wouldn't regain full mobility. But he was alive, and that was what mattered. "I know you," he said suddenly, squinting at her through pain-clouded eyes. "Don't I? Maybe," Margaret said with a small smile. "Educational conference. About 4 years ago, we talked about teaching children in remote areas." His face cleared. Margaret Harrington. "You were working at the coastal hospital." "Still am, technically, on leave to serve here." "That's single quotes S. He shook his head slowly. "That's extraordinary, that we'd meet again here, of all places." "Small world," Margaret said. "Even smaller war, I suppose. Everyone ends up crossing paths eventually." David became one of her patients during his recovery. She checked on him daily, and they fell into long conversations during quiet moments. He told her about the men in his unit, about the friendships formed in the trenches, about the small acts of kindness that kept everyone sane. She told him about the hospital, about the patients she'd treated, about the incredible resilience of the human spirit she witnessed every day. "You're saving lives here," David said to her one afternoon. "You know that, right? Not just keeping people alive, but actually saving them, giving them futures they wouldn't have otherwise." Margaret shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just doing my job." "No," David said firmly. "There's doing a job, and then there's what you do. I've watched you with the other patients. You don't just treat their bodies, you treat their souls. You give them hope when they have none. That's not just a job, that's a calling." His words stayed with her. She'd never thought of her work in those terms before. She was a nurse. She treated injuries and illnesses. But maybe David was right. Maybe there was more to it than that. Maybe the comfort she offered, the hand-holding and the whispered reassurances, and the extra time she spent listening to patients' fears and hopes, maybe that was as important as any medical treatment. David recovered and was eventually sent home. His arm would never be the same, which meant his fighting days were over. He seemed relieved rather than disappointed. "I've seen enough," he told Margaret the day before he left. "I'm going home to teach children and live a quiet life. And I'm going to tell everyone I meet about the nurse who saved my life." "I set your arm," Margaret protested. "That's hardly saving your life." "You did more than that," David said. "But even if you hadn't, even if all you'd done was set my arm, that still would have been everything. Every life you preserve, Margaret, every person you send home, that's a ripple that spreads outward. I'll go home and teach children, and those children will grow up and have children of their own, and decades from now there will be people in this world who exist because you took the time to care about a man with a broken arm. Never underestimate the power of that." After he left, Margaret thought about ripples, about how every action had consequences that extended far beyond what could be immediately seen. Every patient she saved would go on to live a life, to touch other lives, to create effects that would cascade through time. It was a profound thought, and it gave new meaning to her work. The summer dragged on, hot and miserable. Flies were everywhere, making it nearly impossible to keep wounds clean. Dysentery swept through the hospital, affecting patients and staff alike. Margaret herself was sick for 3 days, barely able to keep anything down, but she kept working because there was no one to replace her. And then, in late August, something happened that changed everything. A supply convoy had been ambushed on the road to the hospital. Most of the drivers and guards were killed. The few survivors staggered into the hospital with their own injuries, bringing news that the attackers had seemed to know exactly where and when the convoy would be traveling. There was a possibility, they said, that enemy forces had intelligence about the hospital's location and might target it directly. The hospital staff held an emergency meeting. Catherine, the head nurse, was frank about their options. They could evacuate, which would be difficult and dangerous and would mean abandoning dozens of patients who were unstable enough to move. Or they could stay and hope that the hospital's status as a medical facility would protect them under the rules of war. Or they could stay and prepare to defend themselves if necessary, though none of them were soldiers and the monastery had no real defensive capabilities. "We stay," Margaret said firmly. "We stay and we keep doing our job. These patients need us. We can't just abandon them." There were murmurs of agreement from the other nurses and doctors. They would stay, they would continue working, and they would deal with whatever came. For 3 days, nothing happened. The hospital routine continued. Casualties came and went. Supplies were running low, but they made do. And then, on the 4th day, just before dawn, they heard the unmistakable sound of trucks approaching. Everyone froze. Catherine made a quick decision. "Nurses, stay with your patients. Keep them calm. Doctors, continue your work. Whatever happens, we are medical personnel caring for wounded. That is our protection." The trucks stopped outside. They heard voices shouting in a language Margaret didn't understand. Footsteps on the stone paths, and then soldiers burst through the main entrance, weapons raised. Margaret was in the main ward, surrounded by 60 patients in various states of injury and recovery. She stepped forward, her hands raised to show she was unarmed. "This is a hospital," she said clearly, loudly. "We are medical personnel caring for wounded soldiers. This is a protected facility under international law." The soldier who appeared to be in charge looked around the ward, taking in the rows of beds, the obvious injuries, the medical equipment. He barked something to his men, and they lowered their weapons slightly. He approached Margaret, looking her up and down. "You are nurse?" he asked in heavily accented English. "Yes, we are all nurses and doctors here. This is a field hospital." He nodded slowly, then spoke to his men again. They fanned out through the hospital, checking rooms, looking for something. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her face calm. Behind her, she could hear patients murmuring nervously. She turned and spoke to them in a steady voice. "It's all right. Stay calm. Everything is going to be all right." The soldiers searched the hospital for nearly an hour. They were looking for weapons, for intelligence, for anything that would make the hospital a legitimate military target. They found none of these things because none existed. This was exactly what it appeared to be, a hospital caring for wounded men. Finally, the commanding officer returned to the main ward. He looked at Margaret again, this time with something that might have been respect. "You stay, care for wounded. We do not attack hospital." Relief flooded through Margaret so intensely she felt lightheaded. "Thank you," she managed to say. He nodded once, crisply, then gestured to his men. They filed out as quickly as they'd entered. The trucks started up and drove away, and the hospital staff and patients were left in shocked silence. Catherine appeared at Margaret's side. "Well done," she said quietly. "You kept your head. That might have saved all our lives." Margaret wasn't sure about that. She suspected that the simple fact that they were obviously a hospital had saved them more than anything she'd said or done. But she was grateful nonetheless. Grateful that the soldiers had honored the conventions of war, that they'd recognized the sanctity of a place devoted to healing. The incident became a story that spread through the medical corps. The hospital that faced enemy soldiers and survived through the sheer force of its humanitarian mission. Margaret found the attention embarrassing. She hadn't done anything special, she insisted. She'd just done what needed to be done. But the experience changed something in her. It crystallized her understanding of what she was doing here. This wasn't just about treating injuries. It was about preserving something fundamentally human in the midst of mechanized slaughter. Every patient she saved, every hand she held, every life she fought for was an act of defiance against the forces that sought to reduce human beings to statistics and casualties. The war ground on into autumn. Margaret had been at the field hospital for 1.5 years now. She'd treated thousands of patients. She'd seen men die and men recover. She'd witnessed the full spectrum of human experience compressed into the confines of a converted monastery. And she was tired. Not just physically, though the exhaustion was bone-deep and constant. She was tired in her soul. Tired of seeing young men broken. Tired of the endless parade of suffering. Tired of patching people together just so they could be sent back to the front to be broken again. But she kept going. Because that's what you did. You kept going. There was a young soldier named Andrew who arrived in October. He'd been shot through the throat, a wound that should have killed him instantly. Somehow, miraculously, the bullet had missed his carotid artery and his spine. But he couldn't speak, could barely swallow. Robert, the doctor, performed surgery to repair what he could, but they all knew the recovery would be long and uncertain. Margaret took charge of Andrew's care. She fed him through a tube, administered pain medication, kept his wound clean, and she talked to him. Even though he couldn't respond, she talked. She told him about her hometown, about her family, about the books she loved and the places she'd traveled before the war. She told him jokes and recited poetry and sang songs she remembered from childhood. Slowly, over weeks, Andrew began to improve. He started to make sounds, rough and painful at first, but gradually becoming more controlled. He learned to communicate by writing on a small slate. And he wrote, again and again, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Margaret told him. "This is what I do." He shook his head and wrote more carefully. "You gave me hope when I had none. That's worth more than medicine." Andrew eventually recovered enough to be sent home. He would never speak normally again, his voice permanently damaged, but he would live. He would go home to his family, would find work that didn't require speaking, would live a full life. Another ripple, spreading outward. Winter came again, the second winter of Margaret's deployment. She was 31 years old now, though she felt ancient. The war had aged everyone who touched it, adding decades in experiences, if not in years. There were rumors that the war might end soon. Peace negotiations were supposedly happening, though no one knew if they would amount to anything. Margaret tried not to think about it too much. She'd learned not to hope too hard for things beyond her control. She focused on the work, on the patients in front of her, on the immediate and tangible. In December, a massive artillery bombardment created hundreds of casualties in a single day. The hospital was overwhelmed once again, pushed beyond all capacity. Margaret worked for 48 hours straight, barely pausing even to drink water. She moved from patient to patient in a fog of exhaustion, her training and experience carrying her when conscious thought was no longer possible. At some point during that nightmare shift, she found herself treating a man who'd lost both legs and an arm. He was conscious, in shock, staring at what remained of his body with uncomprehending eyes. Margaret knelt beside him, taking his remaining hand in hers. "I'm here," she told him. "You're not alone. I'm here with you." He turned his head to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that broke her heart. Not fear, not pain, resignation. He had given up. He'd looked at what was left of him and decided it wasn't worth fighting for. "Listen to me," Margaret said, her voice fierce. "I know it's bad. I know you're scared. But you're alive. Do you hear me? You're alive. And as long as you're alive, there's hope. You can have a life. It will be different than you planned, but it can still be good. It can still matter. But you have to fight. You have to choose to live." She didn't know if her words reached him. His eyes remained empty, distant. But she kept talking, kept holding his hand, kept willing him to fight. And after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she saw something shift in his expression. A small spark of determination. He squeezed her hand. Just barely, just a tiny increase in pressure, but it was there. He was choosing to live. Margaret stayed with him for the rest of the night, monitoring his condition, adjusting his medications, making sure he remained stable. And when morning came and he was still alive, still fighting, she felt a surge of triumph so intense it brought tears to her eyes. One more life pulled back from the edge, one more soul saved. She never learned his name. He was transferred to another facility before she could talk to him again, sent to a hospital that specialized in treating amputees. But she thought about him often in the weeks that followed. She wondered if he'd managed to build a life for himself, if he'd found happiness despite his injuries. She hoped so. She had to believe that her words had made a difference, that her fierce insistence on his right to live had helped carry him through the darkest moment. January 1918 brought more snow, more cold, more casualties. But it also brought news that the peace negotiations were progressing. There was real talk now of the war ending. Not in months, but in weeks or days. Margaret allowed herself to feel cautiously hopeful. The hospital prepared for what they expected would be a final surge of casualties as both sides made last desperate pushes for favorable positions before the ceasefire. They were right. The last 2 weeks of the war were some of the bloodiest Margaret had experienced. Men poured into the hospital, broken and bleeding and dying. Margaret and the other staff worked around the clock, pushing themselves beyond exhaustion into some strange state where the body continues functioning even though the mind has partially shut down.